So the other week I put something up on my community tab referencing the news that Bridgestone might be considering coming back into Formula 1, and on top of that I also said that I wasn't going to do anything on that because I'd only recently done a video on Pirelli maybe having competition with regards to that tender. Not a tyre war, drop the nostalgia for 1 second, and it seemed pointless doing another video on it. Fast forward to the Austrian Grand Prix and the whole thing surrounding track limits comes up again. And I've recently done a video on that, so it seems pointless doing another video on track limits. SSDD I think is the acronym to use, but what I can do is seamlessly segue like Linus Tech Tips going to a sponsor bit here, because there's a lot of orange at the Austrian Grand Prix, and there's a man who made some orange cars. That being Bruce McLaren. I've already done the other 2 driver owners of the 1960s, that being Dan Gurney and Jack Brabham. Both great mechanics, both great minds, and both great drivers. McLaren was the same and in a way took it a little step further. In a world before computer simulators, computer-aided design and things like that, you had to not only think outside of the box, but chuck it in the bin and go, fuck the box. And for a New Zealander to get into the top echelons of motorsport, they had to not just be good, but beyond good. Like Fangio before him, McLaren would not have made it in Europe without government intervention. The Argentine government paid for Fangio's boat ticket, and in New Zealand they had the Driver to Europe scheme, which took a driver that had exceptional talent and or potential, and then sent them to Europe to try it against the best in the world. This came about in 1958, when the New Zealand Grand Prix was held at Ardmore as a non-championship Formula Libre race. Formula Libre basically translates to run what you want, and during the FISA FOCA war a race was run to Formula Libre rules, due to it being non-championship. Cars were running skirts, illegal aero, the lot. I think it was the Spanish Grand Prix of 1980, but I digress. But what was good about these non-championship races down under is that it was an opportunity for locals to watch Formula 1 cars, even if the Formula 1 guys weren't there, especially when the Tasman series was formed later on. They would be driving in cars that were similar to those used in Formula 1, but because they were Formula Libre, they weren't constrained by Formula 1 regulations. Ferraris, Coopers, Alfas, Talbots. The actual F1 drivers might not be there, but the cars were. And one of the drivers that was on the grid in 1958 was Jack Brabham, who would go on to win the following year's championship. Brabham noticed that McLaren definitely had something, and made a recommendation to the New Zealand International Grand Prix organisation to give McLaren the first chunk of funding to go to Europe. McLaren was actually the first one to get this funding, which at the time must have been a massive deal, because New Zealand to England isn't exactly a short hop. It isn't now, and it certainly wasn't back then either. Passenger jets, and that's if you even got on one since they were still in their infancy at this time, were loud and slow, and they would have had to have made several stops along the way to get to the destination. Even today, with super economical Boeing 787s, Airbus A350s, and the sad demise of 4-jet aircraft, Qantas in Australia will be offering non-stop London to Sydney flights in 2025. I think that a 747-400 could actually make it all in one go, but I'm not that clued up. I'm sure an aeroplane anorak will be able to tell me. The current longest non-stop flight for a twin-engine aircraft is Singapore Airlines JFK to Singapore, although they did once offer Newark to Singapore, which bumped up the longest flight distance up by 19 miles. So all there would have been for Bruce to do would be to read a book, sleep, look out the window, or write down the lyrics to what would become Belgian techno anthem, Pump Up the Jam. But either way, packing up and heading to Europe. Big deal. Even more so when you think it might not work out, and the fact that McLaren was just 21 years old when he came over. And they hadn't picked him up and sent him over to race in Formula 3 or Formula 2, although he did do 2 Formula 2 races. He got straight in with the Cooper factory team for the 1959 season. And at the 1959 US Grand Prix, where Brabham won his first world title, McLaren would be the youngest ever Grand Prix winner. 22 years and 104 days. He held that record until 2003 when Fernando Alonso broke the record at the Hungarian Grand Prix. At the first round of the 1960 season, McLaren would win again, and at the end of the season he would be second in the World Championship, behind his good mate Jack. In 1963, McLaren founded Bruce McLaren Motor Racing, so he could compete in the Tasman Series in 1964. But Cooper was only willing to run 1.5 litre F1 engines instead of the 2.5 litre engines that were the maximum they could use down there. So the company was set up so that they could buy customer Coopers, do them up, and race them. McLaren would win the 1964 Tasman Series, and later met a bloke called Teddy Mayer who would help him buy a Xerox sports car off some guy called Penske. Mayer then bought into the company and ended up becoming its majority shareholder, and despite being based in England and operating under a British racing licence, McLaren decided he wasn't going to do what everyone else was doing and use national racing colours. He decided he was going to paint them differently. At the 1967 Canadian-American Challenge Cup, or Can-Am Series, McLaren sports cars turned up in a striking papaya orange. And it stuck. By the end of 1965, McLaren had left Cooper and started his own Grand Prix team that had Chris Amon alongside him. In 1968, Denny Hulme left Brabham and joined McLaren, with Hulme being a later beneficiary of the Driver to Europe scheme. The 1966 McLaren was underpowered and slow, with the chassis being designed by Robin Hurd, who would later be part of the March team. The chassis tended to be good, but the engines, terrible. And it was in this time that a McLaren trademark, if you want to call it that, was born. While testing a McLaren sports car, Bruce noticed that the fuel filler cap was flapping around on the straights instead of being pushed down by the air rushing over that at speed. So he pulled back into the pits and started cutting some holes into the bodywork behind the radiator, resulting in the nostrils that you see on McLaren's road cars. Other teams were doing it for cooling, but he was doing it for aero. In 1966, McLaren and Amon famously won Le Mans in the Ford GT40 as part of the Ford 1-2-3 that crushed Ferrari as Ford intended. The following year he'd be fourth as Ford won again, and that would be his last appearance at Le Mans. The McLaren company, it seemed, was doing rather well. It was winning in Can-Am, customer cars were selling, the F1 team had a brilliant 1969 finishing third in the standings, but McLaren wanted to start taking more of a back seat to things and run the company properly, as its stock was growing in both Europe and North America. At the start of 1970, he told his friends that at the end of the season, he'd stop racing and concentrate on the business. On the 2nd of June 1970, McLaren was testing the McLaren M8D just 2 weeks before the Can-Am season was due to start, with the test taking place at Goodwood in West Sussex. While going down the Levant Straight, the fastest part of the track, the bodywork came loose and this resulted in the car becoming unstable. McLaren spun off the track and hit an old bunker that was being used as a marshalling post. And despite McLaren's death, Hulme would end up dominating the 1970 Can-Am Championship, while missing 3 races. The team was handed over to Teddy Mayer, who was the brother of Timmy Mayer, a driver that was also killed in one of McLaren's cars. Under Mayer, the team continued and evolved to become one of the most successful and long-standing teams in Formula 1. It would have success in Formula 1, win the Indy 500, and then merge with Ron Dennis's Project 4 Racing in 1981. Only Ferrari is older and more successful, with McLaren winning 12 drivers' titles and 182 Grand Prix. Lotus, Cooper, BRM, Tyrrell, Brabham, all gone, but McLaren still remains. But Bruce McLaren's legacy continues. He and Brabham set the standard when it came to drivers from Australia and New Zealand, and McLaren is a good shout for when it comes to naming the greatest all-round drivers in history, along with the likes of Jim Clark, Mario Andretti, Sebastian Loeb and Graham Hill. And since McLaren arrived in Europe, drivers from New Zealand have been able to make a stamp on international racing. Denny Hulme won the F1 title in 1967, then you've got Chris Amon winning Le Mans. Greg Murphy, Jimmy Richards, Paul Radisich and Craig Baird have become internationally renowned touring car drivers. Earl Bamber and Brendan Hartley in endurance racing. Scott Dixon is a 7-time IndyCar champion. Scott McLaughlin making the switch from tin tops to open wheels and impressing the IndyCar community. And now New Zealand has probably the best all-round driver active in motorsport today, Shane van Gisbergen. There's also Mitch Evans and Liam Lawson in Formula E and Super Formula. For a country that only has a population of 5 million people, they've had a lot of decent drivers through the years. Bruce must have put something in the water when he left. So then, a look at Bruce McLaren, his racing endeavours and how he paved the way for drivers from New Zealand. If this has been new for you, then do give the video a like so I know I've done an educate, and for more like this, get subscribed for more from this channel. Massive thanks to the people of Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to help support me on a more personal level, a link to Patreon will be in the description, as well as there being links to the F1 Store affiliate, Discord, socials, the works. Well, a super thanks if you think that a pint is required. So until next time, I've been Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.